For those looking for a liberatory martial arts learning approach and curriculum, we've created Liberation Martial Arts. It doesn't just teach you martial arts, it's also a radical and alternative approach to learning. Thanks to Dakota Hughes, Pratik Raghu, and Spencer for signing up. Sign up for Liberation Martial Arts at the Southpaw Pod Patreon, or support us by signing up for one of our other tiers, or by becoming a sponsor. This will give you access to bonus content, transcripts, and uncut versions of our shows without breaks or interruptions. Sponsors also get a monthly training session with me. If you prefer to support others, your sponsorship can go to the training of an organizer instead. There's also ways to make one-time contributions. Find all our links at southpawpod.com. I'm doing a series of interviews with people I've connected with through the Liberation Martial Arts Project, or people I've already known who are re-exploring their martial arts process with LMA in mind. This is the first of these interviews. This is Southpaw. I'm your host, Sam. Today, I have two special guests. Can you two introduce yourselves?
Absolutely. I'm Sophie. I live in Bristol, and I'm part of a martial arts group. I got interested in your work in liberation martial arts, maybe in the spring or summer this year. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Hi, I'm Emmanuel. I live in Birmingham, in the UK. And I've been doing martial arts sort of off and on for most of my life. And I've known about Southpaw for maybe 3 years. I don't know how long, no, maybe before the pandemic even. But Liberation Martial Arts I only really paid attention to since maybe January or something like that. And that's when I started following the Substack.
And then can you two maybe also tell us just a little bit, you don't have to get super specific, but a little bit about your activism work?
Yeah, it's a big question. In the last few years since I've been living in Bristol, I've focused a bit on defendant and prisoner solidarity work, and like local sort of community political education, often around sort of carceral or anti-carceral ideas. I'm being evicted now, but I live quite close to one of the universities here, and I was supporting some of the like radical student movement stuff, and like I guess like most people on the left in the last year or so have focused a bit more on Palestine and supporting work around that. I think like partly because of disability and so on, I tend to be more in a sort of supporting, organizing role than doing a lot of direct action these days. But I try and support people in my community doing more of that kind of work. But yeah, I actually got into activism through working around domestic violence. That's like something that I've sort of carried through the various things as well. So yeah, that's some ideas about. But obviously everything's very connected, and I've not been like, this is my issue at any point. But that's the sort of areas of work that I've been doing in the last few years.
Emmanuel?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've been doing like quote-unquote activism for at least 10 years. I don't know when. Since I moved to Birmingham in 2019 for the first few years, I moved there to open like a worker co-op cafe with some friends, and so I lived there for a while, and then I got a bit burnt out and I fled to Barcelona. But yeah, while I was in, and now I've moved back, and yeah, obviously like everyone, it's all Palestine these days for good reason. Our cafe, our space was a space like an organizing space basically, and lots of organizations were hosted there, and so unfortunately it closed down when I was away. So I was finding my feet again back in Birmingham without my old base, but it's okay. Gym is still going, and so that makes me happy. we've been doing a self-organized anti-fascist gym it started an anti-fascist gym for about 5 years now. And I mean, there's lots of stuff we've been involved in. We did feminist free school, and we did the tenants union and that stuff. So a lot of the stuff still exists. But
So radical training collectives are not new, but having a radical training collective or a space does not necessarily mean a radically different training approach. I was speaking with historian Gabriel Kuhn, who writes about leftist training collectives and gyms. And when I talked to them about an alternative approach to learning motor skill, so movement, he was quite fascinated because independent leftist training projects have been more about having an exclusive space for radicals, but not necessarily about reinventing the wheel when it comes to training pedagogy or even thinking about pedagogy. People just replicated what they knew. You two are facilitators of martial arts training for radicals. There's also a tradition of this. There's also a tradition of how martial arts are taught in general that exists in commercial spaces. There's a sort of training realism, just as there is for capitalist realism. It's just the way it's done. There is no alternative. So let's start there. What have your training and movement experiences been like?
I did high jump when I was younger. So for a while, I was training once a week to jump over a bar, and I liked jumping. I never liked the competitions, and I think something I struggled with was just that, like, the goal is always to make the number go up. The goal is always just make the number go up, and I found that quite tedious. And that's something I really value about martial arts, actually, is like, it can never be about numbers for me because I'm just not on a level where that's even really relevant. So, so I actually am not, I'm coming from quite a different place from you two in that I don't have a background in martial arts at all, really. I joined a radical martial arts gym maybe 3 years ago. So Emmanuel actually introduced me to martial arts at their gym in Birmingham. And so after experiencing that a few times, I found what was sort of the equivalent in Bristol, or the closest equivalent, and got involved. I guess I don't have like a big history of a particular training approach to unlearn, but I also don't have loads of knowledge and experience of movement and martial arts. So yeah, I joined a few years ago after COVID, after leaving a very unhealthy relationship and finding myself quite isolated. And yeah, I found the community really wonderful. But I would say our training sort of pedagogy, well, we don't really have a consistent or like defined pedagogy. I would say our training, as you say, it's the radical element is more about defining like who the space is for than it is about the approach itself. And I think that is a contradiction that I really like welcomed you naming.
Well, what about physical education? Here in the US, we have something called PE classes. I think it's a little bit like the way your gym is run because it's rotational. It's like you do one thing and then you rotate to another activity and you rotate to another activity. And then in a year, you do a bunch of different stuff. For a lot of people, like that's their first introduction to movement. Do they have something equivalent like that where you grew up?
Yeah. We do physical education. Something I remember about physical education is it's very gendered. Like the boys do basketball, whereas girls do netball, rounders in the schools that I was at. I liked team sports. I was lucky at that age to be quite physically able, but I was also always quite awkward in my body.
Are you just kind of thrown in there and it's kind of sink or swim? That's kind of how it was here.
I think a lot of people found physical education at school quite traumatic even. It's very like ableist. It's very like, you know, if you're not meeting a certain standard of physical ability and looking a certain way, then you're sort of grouped together as less than, and like it's not very collaborative in those ways. But I didn't have as bad experience of it as many people do.
Survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
Emmanuel?
Yeah, I mean, I guess as a kid, I was like I am just an incredibly clumsy person, and always was, like really badly coordinated and very not athletic. But I did do judo. Like my mum, like one of the my mum's smartest moves in terms of like maintaining me as a functional human being was have us go to judo once a week. Fortunately, like at least the class, like that was like very like play based and like so much of that stuff my body can still do, even if I can't tell you any of the stuff. So it's pretty amazing having like reflected on like the pedagogies I've had over the years. And even then, I was always like the worst kid in the class, in like every class, always like the least like physically able. And I was also tiny until I was 16. Like after I left secondary school, which I guess joining senior high in American terms, maybe, I don't know. And then at 16 to 18, I started doing like a self-defense class that was happening at lunchtime that was run by this like sort of crabby MMA instructor who had been in like a bodyguard and was a little bit of a lunatic, I would say, but all about that. I mean, you probably know these kind of, you call them chuds, right? Like these kind of people who, you know, back in the 2000s, it was all like learn through pain and all this crap. So I did that for a few years, and then I went to university, and then I came back and did that for a few more years, and then I started trying to do other things with other people. There were like big gaps in my education, basically, for martial arts, and I was never very, as I say, I was always, even in those classes, always like the least good student. Like I learned the slowest, but I'm quite a dogged person. So if I find something I'm excited by, then I'll just keep doing it, even if I'm terrible at it. The last 4 years was where like half my training was like in our red gym, and then the other half was like I'd go to a local gym and just do kickboxing with them, but it was like, it's incredible how much I've improved, how much faster I've improved since I started, even before I discovered LMA, since I started like taking on my own learning, because I was like leading a lot of these classes at the red gym. So I was thinking about what I was learning, why I was learning, what kinds of games that we wanted to do and this kind of thing. Whereas before that, I'd made so little progress over so many years.
So when you took your progress into your own hands, it started getting better.
It is hard to go to other gyms now. It's your fault. So you should know that.
But, you know, when you go to your own gyms, it's more productive, I find, because then you could be more self-directed. Because sometimes you're like, oh, I should get a notebook. You know, I want to retain everything they're saying, because you think it's all about those little details. But then it's like, you can just forget about that and just be self-directed and just not worry about all that and just do the thing and have fun and build kinship.
Totally.
Before becoming facilitators, what were your experiences like at a red gym? What was the approach like?
So joining Radical Gym was definitely daunting. I don't like, martial arts is not a space that I was expecting to find myself in, really. And like a martial arts gym is quite a strange place for someone that's not used to doing that kind of thing. But the people were lovely, and it very quickly became clear that it wasn't a sort of competition, that people weren't trying to like size you up and see whether you were as good as them or anything. And so that sort of helped me relax. And like the approach is quite inconsistent because we've had different sort of blocks of different types of training. And I definitely would like us to like think more about having a consistent approach in terms of how we structure the training sessions. But I think we've always like tried to center fun to some extent and play.
And for you, Emmanuel, what were your experiences like at commercial gyms and at red gyms?
So in terms of commercial gyms, as I said, I've trained at many gyms by this point. So I guess there is some variation. In terms of the red gyms, it's like it was completely self-organized, and each week someone would have volunteered to run the class. So, and then we would replicate what you're used to doing, and so you'd come up with, I would basically just remember classes that I'd done in the past and my favorite bits, and then we'd do that. And I'd always enjoyed the games, both in my judo class and my MMA club instructor from before, James. And he'd always done lots of games with us. And that was always my favorite part. And so I'd always do games, and people loved games. when it was other people leading it, it would, it's funny because I wouldn't have described it as in these terms because I didn't have any other terms to describe them in. It was like, yes, this is how a gym works. You go there and then you hit some pads, and then maybe at the end we do 10 minutes of sparring. And that's sort of how the classes work, except that at the beginning we would like do names and pronouns and tell people that they're welcome to sit down anytime they like. And that was sort of, people were nice, and we would always encourage light sparring and so on, but it was also like there was no system. It was just what whoever was leading generally thought it was sort of meant to be like. And then occasionally you get into these like long discussions, which I would get pulled into and try to avoid making even more tedious than they were, about self-defense. Yeah, can't live with that.
Sophie, you mentioned it felt friendly. They try to center fun. It seemed a bit like physical education, where it was kind of like seasonal, rotating through different things. So everybody got a taste of everything. And so probably a lot of people were fine with that. And also same with Emmanuel's experiences, right? That's just how it was done. There's a long history of these type of gyms, and that's just how it's done. So what made you two think to seek or even think about an alternative?
A number of things for me. I think, firstly, I developed fibromyalgia. On top of, a decade or so of chronic back problems, I developed widespread chronic pain, and stopped training partly because our gym was just struggling with capacity and struggling. And I was finding it a little bit stressful, feeling sort of responsible for things. And physically, I just felt very unsure about what I could do with my body, how I could be in my body. And I was very afraid of causing myself more pain. And I was just in a very fearful space, because when you're kind of having all these sensations of pain in your body, and they're very varied, and it's in different places, and no one can tell you why or what's happening. I didn't know if I should be training apart from anything else. So that was part of it. I think I also had felt for some time or had noticed that people were afraid to spar. And I felt strongly that I needed some sort of, I needed for us to be using the things we were learning in dynamic situations in order for me to actually make progress. But when it came to it, most people were afraid to do that. And so when I looked at the liberation martial arts approach, it seemed like a way that we could move forwards with that, and we could develop safety and develop trust through games and play, and through understanding that that's the goal. Not necessarily the goal, but that we want to have fun and play, and that we actually, for people to learn, they need to feel safe and all of that. So yeah, I was getting frustrated with not sparring. I thought, if we're going to start sparring more, we need to feel able to do that. And that I thought that LMA sort of made sense.
It seems like there's also a connection to your pain, because the way you're describing it is that your pain is unpredictable, right? You don't know what it's going to be like day to day, how it's going to feel. And so precise prescription isn't going to work. Instead, I need a way to adapt to my ever-changing conditions. And so a very static training wouldn't work for that. Whereas the training is meant for you to move however you ought to move based on how you feel that day and the situation. That affords you more flexibility because so much is out of your control.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm definitely not, in our context, I'm definitely not alone in struggling with disability. And, a large proportion of our membership are people who face day-to-day multiple oppressions, but also come into the space holding a lot of trauma in their bodies. And before even we talk about sparring, before I'm even interested in getting us to a point of feeling comfortable sparring, most of us actually need to start by just learning to feel comfortable moving, whether you've got chronic pain or not. A lot of people, as you know, are holding themselves in really maladaptive ways because of both wider traumas and specific to their lives. So I think that's something else I noticed in our community, is people feeling very unsure in their bodies, even without necessarily chronic pain.
And then for you, Emmanuel, what made you think to seek or even think about an alternative? Why wasn't it just this is fine, this is how it's always done, let's just keep doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I always knew it was wrong. Do you know what I mean? I always knew what I was training wasn't the way it should be done. I mean, obviously it didn't help that I had like a guy who would try to cause us pain in order to somehow help. He would like launch stuff at us across the room as hard as possible, and we'd have to dodge them and stuff like this. Like, I knew that was wrong. I couldn't tell you what was right. But like, I guess what happened in my brain was that I just started associating all the bad things I thought about like the pedagogy to like Krav Maga, because it's like so popular in England as well.
Oh.
It's very popular. And in fact, one of my co-workers brought it up to me just yesterday. And I had to pretend not to. Anyway. So I just sort of associated like that kind of like really violent, like the outputs, like the way they'll talk about it, where it's like, oh, you got to go hard as fast as you can, blah, 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 is like, oh, well, that has made people think martial arts should be like this. Because in my brain, it was like, well, as a kid, I did judo, and that was quite gentle, and we played around a lot, blah, blah. So kids, junior judo, from the age of like 6 to 12. So probably other adults hurt each other a little bit more. But like in my head, it was like, there's like a nice sort of Orientalist way to do it. And there's like the mean, like Israeli way to do it. And I shouldn't do it that way. But I don't really know what I should do, because obviously I'm not teaching judo and I don't know the whatever. So it's like, for me, it was like, I would go from gym to gym, and I'd like see bits and pieces where I was like, oh, that's nice. That's a good idea. That's like, that helps people stay relaxed and all of these things. And I just like pick up gems, but sort of, I don't know, almost more or less at random, based on what I thought was like someone being kind and thoughtful, rather than this is like actually bad pedagogy. It was just like, I know that if I want my friends to train, who are mostly queer and disabled and so on, that they need to be comfortable. And so I'm going to bring to a class what I think will make my friends comfortable. But I didn't have like a formal, in any way, like a systematized understanding of what was wrong with what there was. And then like while I was in Barcelona working as a doorman, like at one point I was like starting to get bored out of my mind. So I started listening to Fighters Brew on one headphone, like on shift. And obviously your ads just like keeps playing, even though I think I was already signed up on the ad keeps playing. And I was like, go on. And then like Gabriel Varga had like a course he was putting out that was like £80, and I was like, I can give Gabriel Varga £80, or I can give like some comrades who are trying to do something similar £80 and actually find out what it is. And that's why I actually signed up to play martial arts eventually.
What are some of the challenges that arise when a gym's primary focus is on quote unquote self-defense?
Well, I think it's just a lack of clarity, isn't it? Like you're never going to be able to solve that problem. And I mean, you've explained this better than I could, but people are asking for a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. And I believe that my Krav instructor also believed that. So that was where like he was sort of good in some ways. He'd worked as a bouncer and a bodyguard in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. And like they had all these horror stories, and he'd always be telling you like, we're doing this, but it's not going to, it won't save you. And so I knew it was bullshit from the start, but, people, especially, people on the left feel like they need to be able to be physically capable in order to defend themselves because they feel under threat, and especially people who do sort of anti-fascist work. And the tools that we're given for so-called self-defense have nothing to do with what we actually want as tools for anti-fascism. And so if you like start with the position of self-defense, like you've missed the boat, or you're starting with the wrong question. And so you get a lot of these conversations where people will argue based on whichever cliche thing they've heard said, with relatively little experience, but maybe lots of trauma, or maybe some experience. Like maybe someone who's like, oh, I was in this like dangerous situation with knives and I did this and it worked out okay. And I'm like, I'm glad it worked. I'm glad you're here to tell me that story. But I don't think necessarily we should be saying that this is the way that we should all be training. Do you know what I mean?
This is how I broke my leg. And so you all need to prepare for this exact way that I broke my leg. As if there's only one way you can break your leg. When accidents are an infinite matrix, and likewise, self-defense is an infinite matrix of possibilities.
And people want tricks.
Sophie, did you want to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, as Manny says, you've sort of said this better than I can as well, but that thing of every time there's a surge in far-right activity or an election or whatever it is, people start reaching out to us and asking for self-defense. And when they're coming to the idea of training from a place of fear, it's not a good long-term motivator, and a lot of it is talk, and very, very little practice emerges from it. Also, we've done blocks of training at our gym that are sort of where we've had a self-defense trainer come and sort of do what they would call self-defense training. And ultimately, I can train a specific thing as much as I like. It's very unlikely that that's going to be the situation I'm faced with.
The theme of a lot of what you're saying, and I think it comes from your background, it comes from your positionality, is of unpredictability. All of us can just wake up tomorrow and be disabled. Something can happen, right? And then how that disability expresses itself every day can be unpredictable, the situations we're in.
Absolutely. And you're also touching on how those self-defense narratives are inherently disableist, and they're inherently sort of feeding you the idea that the problem with you is that you didn't know the right trick at the right time, and it's just absurd.
This narrative assumes the problem is you, and you failed because you weren't able to replicate this scripted and static movement in an unpredictable and dynamic and high stakes situation. It assumes that self-defense will happen in some kind of predictable way. And I think especially for disabled people, nothing is ever predictable. That is part of the challenge of navigating the world with chronic pain or disability.
Absolutely.
And I think that is like the unconscious ableism people have, is because for them, the world is much more stable.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I've felt I've needed to sort of learn is that I cannot predict the path ahead of me. I can't map out the terrain. I can't tell you what the storms will bring, what the sea will bring. All we can do is sharpen our ability to perceive the terrain or the challenges or what's ahead of us, and sharpen our ability to trust in our bodies and our experience and our histories, and therefore act with decision and with speed. And that's not something I can learn by repeating the same sort of, I can't learn that by being like, oh, imagine there's a man behind me, I'm going to elbow him. How many situations is that actually an appropriate response? And how many situations are there for me where that response, if I trained it and then did it in a particular situation, where that's actually going to make things much, much worse for me? And I do worry about that when I see self-defense sort of 101 stuff that's like teaching you to throw a punch or whatever. I'm like, how many situations is that actually a good idea for someone like me?
Yeah, I mean, there's like, I've been the victim of like sexual and physical violence, and when I've been a victim of sexual violence, like after having trained Krav Maga and MMA and judo, did I use any of it? Of course not. Right? If I'd been in a space where I could have used it, I wouldn't have been in the situation. And I'm not to say there couldn't be other situations where people might want to and can use it, but it was just like, for me, it was like so clearly not helpful, like so clearly not the answer, because I knew in myself that I had in theory learned these tricks, and it had helped me not 1 second. And indeed, in a sense, it further traumatized me, because it's like, well, I could have overpowered that person. I knew how, and I didn't.
Yeah, and that's the victim blaming.
Yeah.
That's where the victim blaming and ableism comes in.
So with these type of like very defined scenarios, I think there's also something that you two were touching upon, is because it's not just the scenario itself, but when you repeat that scenario, right, and you have to drill it over and over and over, not only is just doing the scenario traumatizing, but now you're reinforcing that scenario to be fixed in your mind, where now you're like, okay, this is the only way this can ever happen, right? Because the repetition kind of reinforces that memory in your mind. It's like, okay, this is all I'm going to prepare for, going all in on that one scenario. And so there's the problem of that. The repetition also reinforces these fixed ideas into your head.
Yeah, and it's actually not good for us to be constantly reinforcing the idea that we're unsafe. Like, if we take self-defense seriously, then we take our health seriously. And I don't think it's good for our health to be constantly reinforcing the idea that we are unsafe and that there are these sort of people around every corner out to get us. I think like there's a danger there to actually not only just like make our training really ineffective because we're stressed and uncomfortable and triggered, but also just causing us more harm to our health. If we really think about self-defense as rooted in our health and our community, which it has to be, especially if you're disabled, you cannot rely on your self-defense being your ability to like physically run away for many of us. And so, yeah, I think like repeatedly putting yourself in triggering situations can be quite harmful.
It replicates the same harm of toxic, just regular physical culture, gym culture, right? It's not motivating to constantly remind people how unhealthy they are. You keep telling them how unhealthy they are, how they look, what's wrong with them. And then, hey, go hit the gym, go lift some weights. Then it's like, wait, this doesn't motivate me to do that, right? So it's like kind of replicating that same thing to self-defense and martial arts.
Well, just following what you said, it's like the reason I do martial arts is basically because I always needed some way to do exercise. And it's the only thing, like, my brain just wants to play games at all times. And it's the only game I ever found that does a good amount of or rather, it's the only kind of exercise I ever did that my brain gets excited about for the games enough that I do it every single day. It's the only motivational structure I ever found that worked, right? And then anytime I couldn't do it, I'm like really depressed and unhappy. And what I really needed was to be able to play and be able to do it in as broad a way as I wanted to, and not feel like trapped by all of these. You have to do it this way, and it's like, oh, but somebody else told me I had to do it the other way, and what should I do? Blah blah blah. Constantly criticizing yourself when you're doing things that I didn't follow the drill correctly, like the kickboxing class. There's quite a few autistic kids who come to that, and every single time I'm working with them, I notice that they're constantly, not just the autistic ones, but they're constantly like, every time they like don't follow the drill correctly, they're like, oh, I died, so blah blah. And that moment is so depressing. When I'm working with them, I'm like, don't worry, you're fine, just keep going.
When you idealize a movement, then it inherently comes with it that you could do it right or wrong, reinforcing perfectionism and harmful self-judgment and blame. Versus if it's more open-ended, it is not like that.
Yeah.
Speaking to something Sophie mentioned about far-right cycles, I can only speak about the US, but when Trump first appeared on the scene over 8 years ago, the left was all about training. And over 8 years later, they're saying the same thing again because they didn't get people to train or stick with it the first time. There's a lot of reasons why. And a lot of it could be personal. A lot of it can be capitalism. But do you think the emphasis on fear and the approach itself, how they're teaching it, has been part of the issue of why we keep replicating the cycle of trying to get people to do something and stick with it because it doesn't happen?
Yeah, I do think so. And, I just have to self-quit basically to some degree. Because, now I'm doing classes where I'm trying to like unteach the bad habits that I taught my comrades. It's quite depressing in some ways. Like I'll see someone like correcting like somebody's form, and I'm like, I wish they wouldn't do that, but also he's telling them what I told him, so it's my fault. And so then I'm like having to like constantly be like, you know what, there's a million ways to do everything, don't worry about it, just play around. And yeah, so I do think that's a huge problem. I mean, I haven't seen him regularly enough, but I have a friend called Dave who I spent like 3 years trying to make him do a like Thai roundhouse, like properly pivot on his leg and blah blah blah. And Dave is built like a brick shit house, as we say. And he just couldn't do the rotation or didn't want to or whatever, right? But I wasted so much of his time and everyone else's time trying to help him get the technique right, when actually he was just more comfortable doing boxing and like the occasional low kick, and that was fine. And that's what he wanted, and it made sense for his build and what he wanted to do. But I spent so much time doing the wrong thing, and sadly to say, he hasn't been back recently. So I hope he does come back sometime. But ever since I started reading your stuff, I've had in the back of my mind like what a bad mistake I made with Dave. So if you're listening, Dave, you should come to the gym. I won't do it anymore.
But that's the thing, right? You're never fixed in time. The process is never done. It's always just growing, and that's the way it should be, right? It's always developing. Sophie, did you have thoughts to add to that as far as like this cycle of far right violence, which is always going to happen. Yet it's not like there's already a pre-existing training practice, right? It's always like a call to arms again because people stopped doing it or never did it the first time or the last time around. And so do you think part of the problem is fear and the approach?
I do. I do think that's part of the problem. But I also think that our anti-fascist crew here, at least, have started to put in place a bit more like proper organization, which I think is also part of the problem with these cycles, is that there's a lot of mobilization and there's a lot of energy, and people say, oh, we want to do this, we want to do this, but there's nowhere for them to go, and there's no like existing structures always for them to express that. It's partly about decentering fear and like recentering community and fun and those things. It's also about organization.
So having structures, organizing is not a bad thing. It actually gives people a place to be like, okay, I have a what, I have energy, I have a drive, I have motivation. So here's a place where you can organize that energy, because when it doesn't have a place to go, it disappears, which is why we keep replicating the cycle of a call to arms.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think as well, it's like people go to the gym like close. Like what I noticed in Barcelona, where they have as many they'd say autogestional, like self-organized gyms. In Barcelona is probably all of the UK has. And when they do their interclubs, it's like they only invite groups in Barcelona and there's hundreds of people. And people come from beyond, but they didn't need to invite them because they wanted to come. I fought someone from Bilbao. It was great. But people go to the gym that's round the corner, you know, for the most part. There's some people who are like, oh, that's my crew from when I lived in that area from a couple of years ago, so I go there. But there's enough spaces that you can go to the one around the corner, whereas in Britain, I suspect, in California, it's like, you know, the spaces that are few and far between, and the clubs are even fewer, and so like the level of commitment necessary to make it happen is like there's just a higher barrier to entry. Whereas, you know, people want to go to a gym that's near the house and they want it to be a place that they can go regularly. And so if you're only doing it once a week, it's also I've also found that to be a huge like barrier that we've had, that we haven't been able to shift to like multiple times a week. And yeah, it is hard to know what is the problem. I'm in a positive way at the moment because our numbers are going up and more people are signing up, and it seems to be going well, and we've been going for a long time. But there's been periods where, you know, we've been struggling to get enough people to pay for the room that we're hiring. We've still moved down to a smaller space. I'm hoping we're going to move back to a bigger space soon. So it is hard to think, and having a good structure where you have an organization that people are like paying into regularly and stuff helps, because then you sort of have this gym membership and people are like, well, I'm paying, so it's good to go. And it's, you know, it's also an area, a place in which we're pooling resources. So it's also like a practical way of creating some kind of level of solidarity. So it does bind us together in a really helpful way. But I do, and from you know, if the goal is for people to actually improve at the skills involved and become more competent, then it is hard to do if it's only like at most once a week.
So to combine those two thoughts, it sounds like there needs to be an infrastructure as well as a different approach. But for there to be an infrastructure, you need even more commitment than a commercial gym might need, because you're trying to build something from the ground up. And so you need more people, there's more collectives, then you could go to a place that is close to you. And so for that all to happen, you also need an approach that promotes consistency, right? So it's all interconnected. But Sophie, can you talk to us a little bit more about navigating training for people, not just yourself, but just comrades you've seen navigating training when they have chronic pain and disability?
Yeah, so I think for a lot of people with chronic pain and disability and neurodivergence in our community, something they need for training is to feel welcome and to feel like their bodies and their experiences aren't a problem for anyone. They're not in the way. They're not holding people back. And I think that's something I really value about the sort of approach that we've been exploring, is I think that it doesn't just say everyone's welcome. It doesn't just say, you know, disabled people are welcome in words. The actual pedagogy itself is grounded in the idea that we need diversity in our training. And part of building diversity is having different training partners who are bringing different boundaries, who are bringing different preferences for sparring and things like that. And so it really welcomes those things. And I really like that. But yeah, it's still a challenge, of course. And it's a challenge to, physically get to a place every week. And it's a sort of mental challenge as well for people to overcome. I think a lot of the time I certainly sort of overly identify with disability in myself and allow that over identification to start telling me what I can and can't do in a way that's not really accurate. I think martial arts can be a really good way to learn actually what your body can comfortably do, which is very healing.
Being included is not enough, right? Just being there is not enough. The training has to center diversity where it's already for everybody instead of like for a certain type of person. And then you get to be included in that, right? Inclusion and like being for everybody is two different things.
Yeah, but I don't think this is like a martial arts thing. I think this is a learning, and one of the things that's just like very wrong with education as it's done like through the state or through this culture is it starts with the idea that you are wrong, that you're missing something, you're empty, you're lacking, you're broken. And it tells you that there's someone here who's not broken or who's not lacking. If you do what they say, you'll gain what you need and you'll become full. And I think a radical pedagogy tries to say, no, we're all whole. We come here full and valid. And a disabled person will likely have different goals from a non-disabled person in a martial arts training space or in an education space. And that's great. We can all learn so much from different people bringing different goals and different experiences and preferences and those things.
Emmanuel, you talked to me about training at a bigger gym, and sometimes you notice people you work with weren't adapting despite you scaling, so they had a chance to adapt. But if you're always taught to memorize and do what the coach tells you, like a soldier who only follows orders, you never learn to think for yourself during the movement practice. So does this type of training go against principles of self-determination and autonomy? And is this an unconscious bias even among some radicals?
Yeah, I mean, totally. And it's like, it's so depressing, really, like the way that we spend so much time like going to the expert to tell us how to do the thing that we do every day. Like I find this at work as well. Like there's like researchers who will come to us and be like, this is how you should be doing the thing. And then everyone who works there turns around and goes, no, we're fine, thank you.
What about the right way to do something?
I've done lots of classes where people have told me what the correct way to do it is. And then I watch them actually fight and they don't do it that way because that's not actually, they don't actually do techniques the way that techniques are taught. One of the things I love about the class is that like you get the games going and then I sort of just like check that no one's hitting each other very hard and I just tell people to breathe. And that's sort of my role. And that's nice. I like that.
Actually, speaking of that role, how did you two end up becoming facilitators? And for listeners, can you explain what a facilitator does?
I am a teacher by training. Like I have a teaching qualification. Most of my work is at the moment private tuition because I don't really, even disability aside, I struggle a lot with the British education system. But recently, yeah, it's not really something I can manage. So I'm mostly doing private education and like community political education stuff. So I guess facilitating learning has been part of my life forever. How I started facilitating martial arts sessions, well, I started by co-facilitating, which is something has been part of our sort of model for a while. Is quite often we'll have an external facilitator who's maybe got a bit more knowledge and experience in the martial arts, but one of our more regular members will co-facilitate. That role is more about managing how we hold the space and how we make sure people feel comfortable and what we do when people get triggered or whatever other challenges get thrown up. So yeah, I started by more in a co-facilitatory role and helping the facilitators plan their sessions as well, because oftentimes they're not the people that came to facilitate. They've been training a long time, but they're not necessarily used to planning classes. So I helped with that. And then it's only really since I was introduced to liberation martial arts that I had the confidence and the that it seemed possible to me that I could facilitate on my own.
Yeah, I mean, I started, as I say, when I came to Birmingham, I knew this gym already existed because I was part of a political revolutionary organisation called Plan C, and they'd helped start a bunch of gyms around the country. And I was moving from a sort of smaller town to a big city where there was already a crew and they'd already started this gym. And yeah, as I say, when I started, it was just like somebody would be running a session because that person had some experience in boxing and Muay Thai. And people would just volunteer at the end of each session as to who was going to run the next one, pretty much. And so I got into it because I'd done training and other stuff, and I was like, well, I'm happy to run some sessions. I'm not the best martial artist. Yeah, and that for me, it felt like it's like I had to admit. Do you know what I mean? I had to be like, I know I'm not very good, but I have been to hundreds of classes in my life, so I know how they work. Which, in hindsight, may not be maybe just gave me an even stronger bias against the healthy model. But so that's how I started training the classes. And then, but what we do, and we would call ourselves like, we would lead the class, we'd usually say, rather than try to like call it instructor, because, we were aware that there were things we didn't like about it. We just didn't have a model as to how to do it better. There's still multiple people who run the classes. I'm not there every single week. And so in other sessions, other people run it how they want to run it. And, people do like the approach that I've been bringing, but it's not like everyone's been like, yes, this is the way I'm going to do it like this. It's just that I run, probably half the sessions. And so it has quite a big influence on the group. And I hope over the time it will have a bigger influence on the group. But yeah, so when it comes to facilitation, for me, it's like I plan a session, which is essentially like I split the 2 hours into 15-minute blocks. The first 15 minutes, the last 15 minutes are like set up and close down. And so then it's just like essentially 6 15-minute blocks where we have like a warm up and then games for the rest of the block. And then in every block, I have like a breathing exercise. So I do at the start of the block, either a breathing exercise or a balance exercise or something that will like help people relax and be in their body in between every game, and then also in between rounds I get people to do shorter breathing exercises, and that's pretty much the whole classes. And then recently we've also been doing WWE wrestling stuff, which people have absolutely loved, sometimes in the second half of the class, and we're hoping to do an actual event that's going to be WWE wrestling, but we haven't organized like that. It's going to be in the new year.
Yeah, we've done a bit of our own pro wrestling over here. It's quite fun. And it also teaches people how to like move and get hit without getting hurt. Looks like we just lost Sophie, which these things happen when you're talking to multiple people across an ocean, across multiple time zones. So Emmanuel, let me ask you this while Sophie gets back on. Did you find as a facilitator what gets people in the door to your gym or your training collective and what gets people staying and continuing are two different motivations?
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of my people I train with was recently saying that there's like a real problem in red gyms where it's like there's a few people who really love to train, and then there's like a wider community of people who think politically and theoretically the gym should exist. And so those people will like turn up occasionally and want it to exist, but it takes like the people who are like really want to come every week to like make it happen. And then it's like people come through the door with like conceptions of self-defense, like we've talked about, and they'll come through the door thinking that's what they're going to do, or they come through the door because they've done Muay Thai before, they've done a bit of boxing before, and they think they know what the gym's about. And whereas what I do actually think makes us stay is that, what makes most people who aren't like obsessed in the way I'm obsessed and just enjoy it and are glad it exists and are going to come whenever they can, is like it's the sense of these people have fun together, and we're enjoying ourselves, and it keeps me a bit fit, and most importantly, again, it's like people feeling like, it's okay for me to turn up and spend half it sitting on a chair. I do think that has been the number one reason why a lot of people A lot of disabled people feel like they can come to our gym, and has always been that way. Otherwise people come, they do 2 sessions, they get absolutely exhausted, they can't move for 4 days, then they don't come back, and that's just terrible, really.
Has changing up practice made it more enjoyable and sustainable for you as a facilitator and participant?
Yeah, I mean, it's been good for getting my ego to chill out a little bit as well, because it decenters the facilitator. It's much less work to plan a session when all I have to do is come up with 6 games and 5 breathing exercises. I don't have to think about how am I going to teach this, how am I going to teach that. So it's incredibly easy to plan the sessions, really. My plans are like 5 words per 15 minutes. It's just like this game, this game, this game, this game. And then I just don't have to think about it anymore. And I just have to go check what game we're playing next. And the other thing is that it can evolve much more organically in the classes than it used to, because it's not so much me telling you have to do it like this, and if you need it different, then we're going to have to spend all the time I just spent explaining this particular sequence of moves in a different way. Like, you're left-handed, so now we have to do a completely different sequence of moves. Do you know what I mean? It's like, instead of that, it's like, we renamed Protect the Crown, Take the Tiara, by the way, in order to get people to, because I couldn't bring people to play a game called Protect the Crown. Like, in this country, we still unfortunately have a crown. The gems were stolen from India. And so I'm not going to protect that. So we played Take the Tiara because, it makes them more gay. And, I tell people, you've got to focus on your soft gaze as opposed to your male gaze. And that people love it. We're all just playing these as silly as possibly named games. And people have a lot of fun. And it's been really good for making me see that we can actually organize it in a way where, somebody wants to do this other thing, and that's okay. I was like, okay, well, just what rules would you like? And, I encourage people to change the rules at any time. Just think about why they're changing them and how. And what I try to do, and sometimes remember to do, is to ask people what they think they learned from a game. And I find that's quite interesting. I mean, I've always done that. You're playing like shoulder taps. I used to call them shoulder slaps, and now I call it shoulder taps. It gets you to rotate your whole body. What they just need to be doing is moving their body and training their eyes. It's the way I see it now. And so, like, more and more, I'm like so frustrated when I see people like correcting, or, they're stopping the game that they were playing to be like, you're doing this wrong, because they've got a preconceived notion of what right is. And I just bang my head against the wall, but have to gently smile and be like, there's lots of ways, and just sort of encourage the game to get going again.
Yeah, gentle is the way, meaning like, don't overdo it, just gentle, just a little nudge, just a little bit. That's all you need. Don't overdo it.
Yeah.
So the way the left often frames training is as drudgery that you should force yourself to do because fascists are training, or because if you don't, they will hurt you. So despite not wanting to, you have to make yourself do it. And they often use comparisons and shame to push people into it, as if it doesn't occur to them. This can be something people can enjoy and fall in love with. This also sounds like toxic gym motivation. So what do you think about this framing, and how do you frame training and motivate comrades without using victim blaming or shame or comparisons or fear?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to catch yourself doing it as well, and there's a question of discipline, where it's like, if people are always turning up late, what do? You want everyone to respect it. There's like an interesting question there where, like, I'm taught that as the instructor, I'm now meant to be like, wait over there and I'll go do your press ups and do your and I don't do that. I just like try and find a way that they can slot into the game that's currently being played. And in terms of like the drudgery and work, it is like, well, basically we don't do any of that. We don't do anything that's boring anymore, or like completely abandoned work. It's just, I get people to be a tree and imagine that a breeze is blowing through the room. And then I open the window and like, oh, now the breeze is going the other way. Like, there's the people might be, and then at the end of the class, I turn all the lights off.
That's what I love, all the creativity, right? It allows for so much creativity where you do things different from me, different from Sophie. It's like so much room to have fun, right? Be creative.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, I got the turning the lights off thing from a French Kempo gym that I was training at when I was in the south of France. Where at the end of a lot of their sessions, they turn off all the lights and then get you to do like belly breathing. And that's the example of like what I said earlier. It's like I pick up little things. Where like, that seems like a good idea. Everyone should do that.
So when you have a lot of moving bodies, a lot of things can happen. It's a lot to watch. So how do you as a facilitator make sure things are safe?
One of the things I do is try to always introduce one thing at a time as in games. I try to make the game as small as possible. Try to warn people of what the risks are that I can expect to see. But yeah, I guess the only thing that's really has any substantial effect is just getting people to calm down as much as possible. Like play, but in a relaxed way. And that is, pretty, Sophie's not here. Like that, I think is like one of the like key things that I'm still like grappling with is like, how do you get people to stay within that like not bored, not stressed zone where they're like enjoying themselves but calm enough to stop themselves escalating and to see what's going on and to stay really, really gentle. Always reminding people to think about their partner, that the difference between like violence and play is consent, and the reason you can do the thing that you're doing with your partner is because you both agreed to it. So make sure you're actually doing what you actually think you've agreed with to it. And I guess one other thing we do, which is really helpful, is at the start of every round, I say, put your hand up if you want to be in the round, and then find someone with their hands up. And so that doesn't assume that everyone's going to be in the round. If anything, it assumes that you're not going to be in the round. And if you want to join in, you can. And that's been really, really nice as well. So I try to sometimes, especially with new people, be like, if you want to stay with your partner, that's fine. But still make sure you put your hand up so that your partner knows you're ready and that you want to go.
Okay, Sophie is back. Welcome back, Sophie. So let's talk about your gym. So your gym had some interesting challenges because of the space you all were using. You borrow a commercial gym space, which has its pros and cons. How important is the space you train in, and how does it influence training?
I think it's both very important, and it's probably also possible to do good training in a wide range of spaces. In some ways, our space, we're very lucky. We've got good safe floor and punching bags and equipment we can use and stuff like that. So we are very lucky in those ways. I struggle a bit with our space because it's between two very loud roads and a very loud roundabout kind of situation. So I find the noise from the roads quite distracting often. One of the ongoing challenge that we have has been people from previous sessions, like that have booked the space just before us. I think within the gym, there's possibly like quite a nice culture of people hanging around and like watching other people's sessions and trying to learn from each other and learn from each other's training. But for our demographic and the kind of people in our group, having unknown, usually men, usually very physically large and dominating somewhat. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with these people. I don't know them, but they hold themselves in a very confident way. For lots of our community, that's really, really distracting, having strangers in the room, especially if they sort of hitting a punch bag or something. I've had so many conversations with these people where they just can't seem to grasp why it might be a problem for someone while they're trying to learn, and they're in a space that's very like not a kind of comfort space for them. Like a martial arts gym is not where a lot of these people feel most comfortable. It's been absurd, the kind of conversations where these people cannot grasp that it might be a problem for people that they're hitting a punch bag or sparring to one side. And I'm like, a lot of these people have experiences of violence. Of course, there being two men punching each other in the corner, distract them. Of course, like how is that? But yeah, and the responses have been not just bewildered confusion as to why it's an issue, but also it then gets turned around that I'm apparently making assumptions about these men, that they are violent or that they are going to cause problems. And it's very hard for them to understand that, no, I don't know them. I don't know you. I don't know you. I just know that I hear you punch that bag and I watch everyone in the room like their muscles tense and their eyes wander over to what you're doing, and they're not in their bodies anymore, and they're not, in the best, most unstartled, agitated state for training. They're now, it's a threat to them, whether it's an actual threat or not. It's perceived as threatening, and it brings up those responses. So yeah, that's been an ongoing challenge that we sort of thought we'd solved a bit by pushing our training later, which was a shame, because that meant that we could no longer join the community dinner after, but we did that for that reason. But then the other people just sort of push it further.
And this touches upon something I was talking about earlier with Emmanuel about how to keep people safe. And that's something you're already doing, trying to make people feel safe or protecting people, because psychological safety is part of safety. So my question is, what are some of the other things you do? Because when you have so many moving bodies, it's a lot to watch. So what are some of the considerations facilitators have to make sure things are safe? Just like that might have been something some facilitators might overlook.
I think something that we try and remember is that I cannot guarantee everybody's emotional safety at any given time. And I can't guarantee that people aren't going to be triggered, that they're not going to experience distress, they're not going to, any of those things. What I can encourage is that we build a culture in which that's okay. I've had sessions where someone is maybe hit in a way that they weren't expecting, or they've become overwhelmed and startled for whatever reason. Maybe it's just a change in how, again, we're working with lots of neurodivergent people. Maybe it's just a change of plan has thrown someone, and now they're just not able to be in the room anymore, like emotionally and in terms of presence. And so we name that, and we frequently remind ourselves that everyone's coming into the space with different experiences and different triggers and so on. And I have, a number of times had to take someone into a side room and help them reground and calm down again. And sometimes after that, they need to go home, and that's okay. And sometimes after that, they're able to rejoin training, or they're able to, sit and enjoy and learn from the rest of training without physically being involved. But we can manage that. And I think some of the ideas around trauma-informed training can focus too much on the idea that we're trying to avoid anyone experiencing anything difficult. And that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say we can safely move through those things. We're not going to try and create situations where people are startled and overwhelmed, but we can move through those things, and we can ground each other and ground ourselves and learn from that. And that's really helpful.
You can over control it until you're just back to ableism again.
Exactly. And it creates this idea that being triggered is inherently harmful. And it's not. I think it's about creating safety for us to unlearn. You've talked a lot about how much of learning is unlearning, and how much of what people are embodying is body politics, is I can't let my belly move in and out when I breathe, because then people will see that I have a belly. I can't I can't move my hip like this because my hips are inherently sexual, and that means XYZ, or there are so many ways that we've been told that movement and our bodies are unacceptable. And so part of safety is safety for your body to be what it is and to move how it moves.
Something you mentioned earlier was naming it. For listeners, can you explain what that means?
I literally mean that not every session, but every few sessions, every so often, at the beginning, we will talk about trauma, and we'll talk about how different people respond. We'll have discussions about what a trauma response might look like, whether it's someone seems zoned out, whether it seems like they're hyperventilating, whether they're suddenly more aggressive or suddenly just defending, they've just got their gloves up and they're not moving, or all of the different ways that we might notice that our partner is not in their best state for training. And then we say, okay, if we notice that, we say pause if we can. We try not to draw too much attention to the situation. And then we, take that, we suggest, let's go get some water, take the person to one side and help, try and get them back in the room, try and do some breathing, whatever it takes. And we try and by repeatedly talking about these things, they become less scary. It becomes less like if someone gets upset that the session is ruined and something's gone terribly wrong. It's like, no, this is normal. This is okay. I don't mean to say it's happening all the time. It's not. But I think for a lot of people, actually hearing it normalized in that way is what can stop it happening. It's not necessarily just people with experiences of violence that might get triggered. It's people can have experiences of, physical education when they were younger that were very traumatizing, or experiences with, certain sounds or the way a certain person holds himself. It can be anything. I'm not saying that it's only people that have experienced like physical assaults that might be triggered in a martial arts space. It's not at all the case.
As well, when you're like working with someone who's like getting startled, like it takes, it doesn't take very much to make them feel comfortable. It just takes acknowledging their situation, and just giving them a little bit of space. And often it's just waiting. And one of the really nice things about the approach is that when you start telling people that they need to be partner centered, and, I say the same thing to people when if your partner's like stops doing anything back, then just stand there, like check in with them, but also you can just wait. We'll let them take the time they need to like get back in the game and decide when they're ready. And that's all you actually need to do. You just need to like give people a little bit of space, and by naming it, as you say, they feel more able to do that.
Any tips for people running or starting their own collectives that you wish you knew beforehand?
Don't believe the hype about weekends being like a good time necessarily. And everyone thinks that it's a good idea because you've got nothing in your schedule. But you don't have anything in your schedule regularly, but you will have something in your schedule every weekend. And it's a mistake multiple gyms I know have done, including my one. And we've never really been able to break out of it, because obviously once you've got people who come on a certain time, that's excluded everyone who can't come at that time, but at least it's included the people who are coming, if that makes sense. And so then moving is difficult, because now you have to find a place where everyone who's currently coming can do another time. And so we're hoping to move to a second day as soon as possible, but it's going to require a few more subscriptions. Yeah, a subscription, sorry, really, really boring, but I think subscriptions are really necessary, unfortunately. Not to say you shouldn't also have like our model is you pay what you can afford. We have asked, like how much, like an ask price. We just raised it to £7 per session, or £20 per month by standing order, like direct debit. I mean, it's pretty cheap anyway, but that's just like our requested amount. But it's always been very clear, and indeed, long periods where you like barely took any money, it's like pay what you can afford. And, by having that subscription model, it makes it so that the club can plan better and you don't have to worry too much. But obviously that requires enough like committed like comrades who are going to have stable financial income to be able to put £20 in or £30 in, or whatever it is they're willing to put in. So that's really good. Having a small organization that just sort of functions is a good idea. You don't have to overcomplicate everything. Like the way we do it is that we have a signal chat that is an organizing signal chat that anyone's welcome in. And then we have a WhatsApp chat, which is just announcements where we literally just put in, and we make a rise up pad every single week that has our training agreement in it. It has the address of where we're training, and then it just has the date and who's signed up this week and who isn't coming this week. And then we post that in the WhatsApp announcements chat, and we post it in the signal chat, and we ask people to say whether they're coming. And that's partly really functional, because if we don't have enough people, or in the periods, especially some summers, when we've had many fewer people, it means we can cancel the session ahead of time and not lose money on booking the space if we know that nobody can come. But also it just like keeps it going throughout the week, if you see what I mean. You're thinking about it because you have to remember to sign up on the thing. And, if there's too many people going to sign up, the room's going to be full. As from the facilitator's perspective, if you know this person is coming and last time they were having a trouble with this thing, and you thought of a game that maybe would help them with, like, they're having trouble checking kicks, and so you wanted to come up with a checking kicks game for the next time they were there, and they're coming in advance, so you can plan for it. So that's really helpful as well. So yeah, we keep it like small and simple, but like sort of regular.
Talk to people, when especially new people that arrive. I've seen situations where there's a new person arrived, and then a sort of group is forming of people that have been coming for a while, and they're talking to each other, and this new person is sort of wandering about looking a bit aimless. Don't let that happen.
Yeah, that's true.
Talk to people, and so much of comfort and emotional safety is getting to know the faces and voices and of the people you're working with. I think something I need to learn maybe is like letting go of attachment to the permanence of the project, or just letting go of control a bit. It's probably something I need to work on in a lot of parts of my life. But the facilitator's role is one of guidance, or structuring and organizing. It's not one of controlling, or I obviously can get very frustrated if I feel like people aren't committed enough or whatever. But it's like that's not something I can control. That's not something. All I can do is provide fun and hope that people will want to commit.
And also, I think important for all of us is their lives are not in our hands. Like, we can't guarantee their safety. We can only do so much, whether in the gym or outside. Something could happen to them. And it's like, that's not all on us, right? We can't have some kind of messiah complex about it. So I think that's a really great point.
Yeah, of course. Definitely.
All right. Thank you both for your time, especially with the time difference and technical problems. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you.
Keep doing what you're doing. And other people should sign up for liberation martial arts, if Sam would say.
Yeah, honestly, no, I thank you so much, Sam, not just for this conversation, but for all of your writing. Like, even if, I never train martial arts again for some reason, the approach is so much bigger than martial arts. And, I've been interested in liberatory learning approaches for a long time, but I've never really come across something so tangible in terms of embodying a more liberated approach. So thank you very, very much.
Well, I really appreciate it now. All right. Thank you so much. If you like this episode and like what we do, support us on Patreon. We also have the Liberation Martial Arts program if you want to train with us from wherever you are. What you're learning is how to teach yourself. It's also an approach you can take with you into the world. Sponsors get a monthly training session with me, either in person or online. You can also sponsor the training of an organizer instead, or support our training organizer program or me directly. Find all our links, including Southpaw merch, at southpawpod.com. With that said, thanks for listening.